President Cyril Ramaphosa says government plans to do away with the Public Enterprises Ministry after the 2024 general elections. And this was announced during his Q&A session in the National Assembly yesterday. And just to remind you, he also said state-owned entities that fall under this department will now be placed under a new holding company. Let's bring in political analyst Lebogang Pheko to share thoughts on these latest developments. Good evening to you and welcome. I know you're not happy with this move. Wrong ministry, wrong time. Why?
Well, it's not so much unhappy, Imani. I think it's just a case of the rationale and the timing, but also the rationale, particularly because just a few weeks ago during the SONA, the president had already given an outline that of some kind of what he described as a potential saving of 27 billion if the overlapping mandates were dealt with. And he mentioned closing ineffective programs, I quote, and consolidating entities which, were appropriate. And he also mentioned that local government as a performance anchor had been particularly poor. Now, he also in this highlighted that many state-owned enterprises are struggling. He mentioned debt, he mentioned underinvestment in infrastructure, and he also mentioned the effects of state capture and the skills shortage. And in closing, he then said that the Presidential State-Owned Enterprise Council was going to be established in order to then put in place a model, a shareholder model, to then understand how better to run SOEs and to put in place what he describes as effective oversight. So we're not sure what the outcome of the State-Owned Enterprises Council has been. And I think that it seems a bit preemptive to then discuss the notion of then dissolving the Department of Public Enterprises, because as we are aware, the primary mandate of the Department of Public Enterprises is to look after these very troublesome SOEs of ours, including Transnet, including Eskom, including Denel, and quite a few others. Now, we could make a case for harmonizing, rationalizing many of those SOEs, for examining whether or not some of them are still as effective as they could be. There's also a case to be made around rationalizing the way that they function, the shareholder model between state and private enterprise, potentially looking at how other countries have managed to rationalize and perhaps build the efficacy of the state-owned enterprises. But it does seem that of all the things to do, dismantling the Department of State-Owned of Public Enterprise without providing a transitional plan, or at least expressing what it might be to the public is very unfortunate, and it's certainly leading to some confusion and quite a bit of upset and discomfort.
Some of those things that you said, is kind of the sweet spot that's needed to manage and, in fact, resuscitate some of the SOEs and bring them back to full functionality seems to be what the president articulated as the objective of the SOE holding company. Some of the things like bringing back financial discipline, making sure that there's proper procurement governance, and enhancing proper coordination. These are, three big objectives. But what you're cautioning is that practically it may not and possibly not unfold as envisaged.
It might not. And I think the other thing that we're not sure whether or not and where these these state-owned enterprises are then going to be housed. So does this mean then that the department, that Transnet, for example, as an entity, will now come under the Department of Transport, for example? Does this mean that then Eskom will now then be under the aegis of, I suppose, the new Ministry of Electricity or the existing Ministry of Energy? And I mean, there's a case to be made about whether or not we actually need two different departments that are essentially both dealing with energy, for example. We're not sure then what happens to entities like the NEL, etc. And I think the other thing that's quite useful to think about in money and the viewers is the economic value that is generated by the intellectual property that is represented by many of these SOEs. So, for example, the NEL and so forth, some of the space and nuclear technology that they have been pioneering, some of the really interesting innovations in military technology that they've also been innovating that other countries make very good use of far beyond South Africa, by the way. A lot of our scientists and so forth are highly sought after by NASA and by other international bodies or other bodies far away from Africa, unfortunately. And I do think that we need to really think around what the value is of then dismantling that really important economic and intellectual property footprint and perhaps removing the anchor, its anchor in the form of this particular government department.
You know, you raised some really sobering points, and again, I just only wish we had more time to tease things out, but it sounds like this might be, you know, in the lack of detail that you're saying, you know, what about this and what about that, that this could be a costly and a dangerous exercise or experiment for us. Would you go that far?
Well, I would just say that perhaps the president needs to give us more information. I think give the country more information. But they may very well be a contingency plan that we have not yet been apprised of. It may well be that this is the opening of a conversation that then needs to continue. It may well be that it's a statement of intent, but not one that is going to be transacted in the next 6 months, for example. We don't know. And I think it's the variables which are making a lot of commentators uncomfortable.
Yeah, just a really quick one, Lebogang. I just wanted your thoughts on, well, you know, we're supposed to be moving towards trimming a bloated cabinet. What would you have opted for as you know, cabinets, portfolios that we could just actually do without?
I don't know if it's do without or whether they could be rationalized. I mean, I think one wonders whether perhaps water could be part of the environment. One wonders whether or not we do need a ministry of electricity and whether that should not have been integrated and remained under the aegis of perhaps the Ministry of Energy. There's just a whole host of other ministries, forestry, agriculture. There's just scope to rationalize in different places. But at the end of the day, Imani, I think what it comes down to is how effective any government department is and any ministry is. It comes down to the quality of people who are employed rather than deployed in those departments. And it comes down to whether the PFMA and other standard operating procedures of the state are actually in place. It comes down to whether or not the right people are employed in the right places. And that is really what it's all about, whether we have a civil service that is, I think that we've got some of the best technocrats in the world and we don't congratulate ourselves enough. But what we don't have necessarily is the kind of policy consistency and leadership to enable those technocrats to be able to function at optimal level. And I think to visibilize some of the really stellar contributions that are taking place so that no matter how much we rationalize, re-rationalize, merge, submerge, collapse, create different government departments, the work remains. And I think with a clear policy direction, that is what we need to be aiming towards, where the work remains intact and where things are not shifted around as personalities are shifted.
Really appreciate your insight and your input, Lebogang Pheko. Lebogang Pheko is a senior researcher at Trade Collective.